I think there are two conflicts. I think there is a Russian-Ukrainian conflict indeed, but this is of course also to a large extent also a conflict between the West and Russia, and it's also more or less more by all sides being portrayed as such, and so in that sense. I think you couldn't, even if you were to try, you couldn't solve it solely on a Ukrainian-Russian logic. I think the wider picture would have to be brought in if you want to get out of this crisis.
Welcome. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I am joined today by Ambassador Thomas Greminger, who's a Swiss diplomat and currently the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Before moving to academia, Ambassador Greminger served for 3 years as the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE. Ambassador Greminger's diplomatic career focused on conflict resolution and human rights. He served as the head of the Human Security Division of Switzerland's Federal Department of Foreign Affairs from 2004 to 2010, and after which he then became Switzerland's permanent representative to the OSCE in Vienna from 2010 to 2015. In 2017, he then became the organization's Secretary General, where he acted as an effective crisis manager in an increasingly polarized environment. Ambassador Greminger was responsible for promoting dialogue among the 57 OSCE participating states. Among other issues, he also helped the OSCE maintain field presences and supported participating states in implementing OSCE commitments and preventing or managing conflicts, notably the special monitoring mission to Ukraine. Today, we will, of course, use this opportunity to talk mainly about the OSCE, Russia, Ukraine, and European security. Ambassador Greminger, thank you very much for joining me.
Great pleasure. Great to be with you, Pascal.
Ambassador Greminger, so in your various roles at the OSCE, you observed for many years the conflict in Ukraine, I believe. Could you please tell us when Ukraine first appeared on your radar? When did you first notice it as a real problem in European security? And what were the turning points in that escalation over the years? And what is, in your view, fueling the conflict?
I would argue it came on my personal OSCE radar. Obviously, it was much earlier subject of OSCE attention, including of also OSCE field missions. But on my personal radar, I would argue it was 2012, 2013. In 2013, Ukraine became the chair of the OSCE, and since Switzerland was about to chair in 2014, I was part of the Troika. So we started looking very closely, and we also started being more concerned about rising tensions in Ukraine in the course of 2013. This was tensions between a pro-European and a pro-Russian camp, partly not fully, of course, overlapping with linguistic camps, a Russian-speaking minority, relatively strong, as opposed to a Ukrainian-speaking majority. And towards the end of 2013, we clearly, felt there is a major crisis approaching. But of course, we wouldn't have anticipated what then was going to happen in 2014. When Switzerland started chairing the OSCE in January 2014, we immediately, started offering de-escalation measures, offers to promote dialogue, etc. They were all turned down for the first couple of months, and there is a telling illustration of this by the then president of the States Confederation, who happened to be the chair in office of the OSCE, President Burkhalter, traveling to Sochi in order to meet President Yanukovych. And he was then left waiting for like half an hour or so, and then in a relatively brief meeting, he was told by President Yanukovych that everything is under control, no problem, don't worry, and no interest, for any de-escalation efforts. 10 days later, President Yanukovych had to leave Kiev. And then all of a sudden, there was a major concern, interestingly enough, by all stakeholders, the new Ukrainian government, the Maidan government, but also a concern by Russians, Americans, and by Brussels that, the situation could spin out of control. And then there was a request submitted to the OSCE to come up with de-escalation measures, and that was then very much the focus of the Swiss OSCE chairmanship in 2014. Some of these measures were successful. I successfully negotiated the mandate of the special monitoring mission to Ukraine. That was in the first weeks of March. And I think that then turned out to be one, if not perhaps the most significant instrument of escalation prevention. Other instruments did not work out. And for instance, we launched in April a major intra-Ukrainian dialogue process led by Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. And that process had some traction initially, but then after the election of President Poroshenko, the process was dropped, not pursued, to our major disappointment. And then, the OSCE then more was busy in monitoring the ceasefire that came about the conclusion of the first Minsk agreement in September 2014. And the SMM then turned into a mainly ceasefire monitoring operation. And I would argue, that between 2014 and 2021, the OSCE was relatively successful in managing the conflict, in preventing further escalation, in making sure, that 3 million people on both sides of the line of contact had access to water, gas, electricity, etc., because it was mainly the special monitoring mission to Ukraine that facilitated these windows of silence that allowed for repairing these infrastructures, that were again and again that broke down due to shelling. So I would argue the successful part of the OSCE intervention was conflict management. The far less successful part was conflict resolution. There was this trilateral contact group, where the OSCE had a facilitating role, where all the signatories of the Minsk agreement sat around the table, but this platform suffered very much from a lack of political will by the main parties to really advance in implementing the Minsk agreements.
Can I ask you about this one? Because now we're talking about the period between 14 to 21, when there already was very heavy warfare going on inside Ukraine, in the Donbass, in the eastern region, and this contact place, right, on where the self-proclaimed two People's Republics then met with the Ukrainian forces, and the OSCE was then used also as a institution that monitored what was going on and tried to do this conflict resolution. And in the international media, there is this discussion about who failed Minsk, who did not implement the Minsk agreements. Why was this resolution that was proposed in 14 and 15, why did it never work out? From the perspective of the neutral observer, the OSCE, who's responsible for this not working out?
Well, you had two basically sets of provisions in the Minsk agreement. Well, you also had more economic and humanitarian provisions, but mainly you had security-related provisions, and you had political provisions that very much related to the status. To elections, to amnesty, and when I talk about the status, of course, I refer to the special status, implying, a high degree of decentralization, and so basically, the sides never agreed on what would have to come first. There was this a constant fight about, is it security that needs to come first, and once you have a watertight ceasefire, that you would then address the political provisions, or would it be the other way around, or would it be in a sequence process? So, and one of the problems was that the Minsk agreements did not really entail any implementation plan. It was clear, if you read the Minsk agreements carefully, it was clear that control over the Ukrainian-Russian border by Ukrainian authorities would only be given once the political provisions would be implemented. That is, once a special status would have been agreed, amnesty given, and elections held. And that was clear, but absolutely no detail in what steps, this goal would have to be achieved. And that, of course, made it also extremely difficult for any government in Kiev to kind of offer the kinds of political concessions that would have allowed to implement the political provisions of Minsk, and this, would have come at a high domestic cost, and so there was a big reluctance to move ahead in implementing the political clauses. Obviously, on the sides of the separatist republics, on the side of the armed formation, they had an interest to constantly show their nuisance value by, not fully implementing the security-related provisions of the Minsk agreement. And then, of course, the sheer fact that, the combatants on both sides along the line of contact, they were so close, as close as, combatants would have been in a First World War setting, that it is not surprising, that often there was simply military activity because, military logic then prevailed. If you see an enemy, then you start shooting. But I think at the end of the day, it was this constant struggle about what first, security or political provisions. And then, of course, who is a party to the conflict? This was another major disagreement that was never resolved. As you are certainly aware, the Russian Federation always pretended to be a facilitator and not a party to the conflict. And but obviously for the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev, it was equally clear that the Russian Federation is a party to the conflict. And this was another major disagreement. I should add that there was, in my view, a window of opportunity when President Zelensky came into power in summer 2019. I think he was truly committed, to also advance implementing the political clauses. I think he was also ready to accept considerable political cost. After all, he was also, elected with a very, very clear margin. So, I mean, he had political attitude. But I think then President Zelensky realized there was little reaching out on the other side. So from the Russian Federation, there were hardly any concessions offered. And so for Zelensky, it remained unclear, how by offering a special status, for instance, how would he then practically come closer to controlling again, these territories and eventually the Ukrainian-Russian border. So it was for him very difficult to convey to his constituency in Kiev, well, okay, if I give, for instance, the special status enshrined in the constitution, if we define what the special status would mean in terms of decentralization, what would I get in return? It was just not very clear politically for him. And this was, I think, also clearly a lack of outreach, lack of flexibility on the Russian side. And then, of course, resistance started mounting also in the Ukrainian parliament, in the Verkhovna Rada. And I think after after half a year, this window of opportunity started again closing down. And, when the military buildup of the Russian Federation in the east, the north, and the south started in late fall of 2021, I think, the prevailing impression was that Minsk agreement implementation was at an impasse, was stagnating. There was no perspective to move into again a more positive dynamic.
In December 2021, Russia sent these famous or infamous two draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States. I suppose the OSCE was not in any way considered also as a forum of dialogue for this kind of grand strategic talks. How did you interpret this moment when this very highly unlikely diplomatic action took place, when Russia basically reached out very publicly and wanted to negotiate a security agreement for Europe very publicly, but only with the US and with NATO, not with the Europeans, and it didn't try to do it through the OSCE? How did you interpret that step? Was that a provocation by the Russians? Was that like a last-ditch effort by Russia to say, like, we want to be on the big powers table? What did you make out of that?
I think there is I would say there is a legitimate security concern in the sense that the Russian Federation wanted to have a sort of a buffer zone of friendly countries around itself, right? So basically, if you look at all those states that geographically happen to be in between the Russian Federation and NATO, there was, of course, a Russian interest that these states would not be unfriendly to the Russian Federation, and obviously would not be used for stationing data infrastructure, weapon systems, that would reach its main cities, St. Petersburg or Moscow, within minutes. So I think there is a legitimate concern, and a legitimate concern that is also based, on the dilemma between two fundamental security principles. Or principles of European security, if you want. On the one hand, there is the right of every state to freely choose its security arrangements, including its alliances. But on the other hand, you also have the principle of the indivisibility of security. That means that you should not augment your own security at the expense of another state. Now, if you apply these two principles to these states in between, you obviously have a dilemma that I think you should acknowledge and then try to address diplomatically. And I think there are approaches to solve and to reconcile the dilemma. So I think I would argue legitimate security concerns. However, these two draft treaties, of course, requested basically a formal agreement that Ukraine would not become a NATO member, which violates one of the two principles that I just referred to. And politically, of course, it was also not realistic, that kind of NATO would revisit its open door policy, would officially come back to the 2008 promise to Ukraine and Georgia. So I think it was not realistic to expect that neither the US nor NATO would respond positively to these two draft treaties. What then came in January 2022, end of January, I think the 26th of January, if I'm not mistaken, this US response to this Russian draft treaty was extremely interesting and extremely substantive in terms of its offer to negotiate military risk reduction measures, to enter into negotiations on sub-regional arms control measures, to tackle also, more fundamental issues of European security. And there were also references in this letter to platforms. There was a reference to the strategic stability dialogue, which would have been the bilateral a platform between Russia and the US, to the NATO-Russia Council, and there was also a reference to the OSCE in that letter. I think what perhaps the letter was short of is, explicitly acknowledging that there is this dilemma between the two principles that I referred to. And perhaps the even bigger problem was that the letter came at a point where public diplomacy between Russia and the West was already so loud, so aggressive, that probably it was kind of difficult to then acknowledge that, hey, wow, now there is really a very substantive negotiation offer on the table. And I think that's a pity. But I would still argue, with hindsight, it was clearly a missed opportunity, that diplomacy did not pick up this very substantive American offer. And perhaps in a more positive, forward-looking perspective, If one day, we manage to put an end to this war, and if the end of this war is also something that most stakeholders can consider as fair, I think I would, really recommend to get back to that menu that was put on the table. And I think that could be an interesting starting point for an attempt to somehow restore some order, some cooperative security elements in European security.
You in the OSCE, you've got these 57 member states, and it's this organization that includes Russia, includes Mongolia even, and the United States and Canada and all the European states. It's really this one truly comprehensive security organization. And one of the things that's often forgotten is that the OSCE that came out of the Conference for Security and Cooperation, this Conference for Security and Cooperation was the idea of the Soviet Union at the time, and then channeled through Finland and put into motion. And over a 5-year process, it then took place. Now, today, a lot of people argue that Russia cannot be trusted. You cannot sit with Vladimir Putin at one table because they never keep their promises. You, who has worked diplomatically with the Russians and the Ukrainians, how do you see that? Is there still a window, or is there still the possibility for honest, real negotiations with Russians and the Ukrainians and come to a conclusion? Or do we need to wait until, I don't know, the entire situation in Russia changes or one of the two parties completely loses the war? How do you see that?
Look, I mean, relations between Russia and the West and Russia and Ukraine, for that matter, were already very complicated before the 24th of February. And now, of course, this, and I've been often referring to the lack of trust between major stakeholders of European security. And this lack of trust was also, often used as an explanation why there wasn't any serious discussion on military risk reduction, on confidence security building measures, not to speak of arms control. I mean, we didn't have serious arms control discussions for, well, 1.5 decades, basically, in Europe. So this lack of trust is, of course, now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is even deeper. And I would argue that, without some very clear deeds from the Russian side, it is difficult to imagine, anything that would come close to a Helsinki process, that was launched in 1972. Having said that, 1972 was 4 years after the Soviet Union invasion of Prague. So, it was, not in a very harmonious time that the Helsinki process was launched. And so if there is political will by major stakeholders at some point, once the hot war is over, and of course, very much also depending on the end of the war. If it's a victorious end, a victorious peace, I think it will be very difficult for many years to come to somehow, imagine Helsinki 2.0, a process where, major stakeholders of European security would again try to figure out some elements of cooperative security. If there is a negotiated end to the war that, can be considered by and large as fair, I think it would be easier to kind of again come to a trust level that would allow at least to kick off a process. And you know, in 1972, it was not clear that the process would end with the Helsinki Decalogue. I think there was a lot of political leadership. There was a lot of, you know, also engagement, by the way, not least also by the non-aligned, the neutral and the non-aligned. They were important drivers back then. But I think most of all, there was clearly a political commitment back then to somehow manage this Cold War, and in a constructive way. Right now, there is no such political commitment, and I think this will be a prerequisite for relaunching something, you know, that comes close to Helsinki 2.0.
Yeah, I mean, it took basically 10 years from 1962 to 72 to go from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the start of the CSCE negotiations. Yeah. And this is a very important time. A guest whom I interviewed here, Ambassador Jack Matlock, pointed out that these are very long stretches that it took in order to get to these de-escalatory moments. But one of the other things that's so important, I believe, is that the Helsinki process happened in Helsinki also because Finland was able to play this neutral role and also was trusted by several parties. The Minsk agreements were done in Minsk because Belarus was kind of between the fronts, at least back in 2014 and 15, and was trying to help both of its partners. At least that's the way I perceived it. And by now we're losing neutrals in Europe. Belarus has scrapped its neutrality article in its constitution and joined the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Finland and Sweden just said they just send in their applications for NATO. The air is getting thinner in Europe in terms of like neutrals that are still there. What do you make out of that process? Is this part of a polarization of Europe? Is this bad, or is this? Do you see some? What do you make out of this situation that we are losing neutrals?
Yeah, I think it's short-sighted. I think, you know, when I see the degree of polarization and great power rivalry that we are currently witnessing, and there is clearly no end in sight. On the contrary, polarization is increasing, and it's not only between Russia and the West. You know, there is also this China and the United States, this rivalry, and I think in these kinds of settings, neutrals can be extremely useful to, you know, build bridges, to facilitate processes. And I'm also, you know, I share your concern that by losing now, you know, very capable neutrals like the Finns, that if opportunities arise for processes like you know, Helsinki 2.0, that you then would need drivers of such a process. I would still argue, of course, the prime prerequisite for such a process is major power commitment to it. But then you need neutrals to drive, to facilitate, and the fewer neutrals we are, I think the more challenging it will be you to find these. And you know, I think Turkey-style power mediation that, as we, you know, currently see it attempted in the process that led up to the Istanbul communique, I'm not sure, you know, that this is the kind of process that is conducive to success in something as complicated as coming to a new understanding of a European security order. Perhaps on a more positive note, you know, conflict experts have for many years pointed to neutrality or non-alignment as a potential solution for countries that happen to be in between, between Russia and the West. But I think you could argue similarly between, another big power and another big power in other regions of the world. And here, I think the fact that we have been seriously discussing neutrality for Ukraine is interesting. I mean, I don't like the idea of having to discuss neutrality at gunpoint. That's not something, a concept that I like, but that you start discussing neutrality as a solution, neutrality obviously linked to security guarantees for states that geographically just happen to be between major powers. I think that again is interesting and points to neutrality as also a forward-looking concept.
Let me just go to the Turkey comment that you made. That surprises me because I interpreted Turkey as playing a very constructive role in trying to resolve the conflict. But you said that there are issues about that. What did you mean? What do you mean by that? I thought Turkey is playing this kind of the most neutral part of NATO in this conflict. But am I perceiving this wrongly?
No, I wouldn't disagree with that part of the assessment, but they're clearly playing it as a regional power, and it's not the type of mediation that you would expect from a country like Finland or Switzerland or Austria, for that matter.
Not the uninvolved.
Yeah, and it's clearly, implicitly and partly explicitly also flagging, the power that the country has in the region, and of course, the partly Turkey has interests, major regional interests that align with the Russian Federation, but also has major interests that align with NATO and the United States. And I think this, I think Turkey used quite skillfully in mounting that process that led to the Helsinki communique. But it's a totally different type of mediation that what that you would expect from a neutral.
I see. Thanks for that. On the other hand, we have these international institutions, certainly the United Nations. We also now have the Red Cross involved in what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and the OSCE too. And in a sense, all of them are handicapped by the same problem, which is that their members are at war with each other. So they're kind of forced, the United Nations Security Council is blocked. What's the situation of the OSCE? Is it blocked as well, or what is going on inside the OSCE in terms of diplomacy? Because I didn't actually hear anything about the OSCE in the past 2 or 3 months. It's as if though the organization had kind of left the scene.
Yeah, I mean, your observation is certainly correct. The OSCE is currently polarized to a degree that makes the organization to a large extent paralyzed. And generally speaking, I would argue the OSCE, but I think in a way this is valid for all international organizations. Multilateral organizations, they work if major powers are interested in using its tools and its platforms. this was, for instance, coming back to our previous discussion in 2014, when there was this concern of the crisis in and around Ukraine spinning out of control, there was an interest to launch the OSCE, and at least some of its de-escalation tools. In 2021, late fall, winter, this was not the case, and now, of course, we need to ask why. Partly, I think it was because there was no interest to use the OSCE, or the interest came in very, very late. All of a sudden, the United States again showed interest to use the OSCE as a platform to discuss fundamental issues of European security, to political military issues, while for many, many years, there was no US interest to do so. And so, and the irony is, once the US started interest, the Russian Federation had lost interest in using the OSCE platform for discussing political military issues. And in that sense, I think the biggest missed opportunity is the structured dialogue that had been launched, by the German chairmanship, by the Hamburg Ministerial Council in 2016. That would have been the ideal platform to discuss many of the issues that, then arguably have led to this build-up of the crisis that we have witnessed since last fall of 2021. Now, that's the major power picture. Now, the OSCE institutional picture is, of course, also characterized by leaderships that have, from the very beginning, taken sides, that have not really tried hard to act in a facilitating role. I think this is both Sweden and the current chair, Poland. They have taken very clear positions, and for instance, the Russian Federation, and this was clearly before the 24th of February. There was not enough, faith, trust in the organization to use it as a conflict manager, as a facilitator for a way out. So I think that is perhaps also a perspective that one should not forget. Having said this, already during the military build-up, it was, of course, very challenging for an organization like the OSCE to kind of defend its principles, and this military build-up was obviously a massive violation of some of its principles, and at the same time remain in dialogue with everybody and remain available as a facilitator. I mean, this is a walk on a tightrope, and I think, yeah, with hindsight, I would say this walk on a tightrope was not, really attempted, and I think right now the OSCE is fighting for its survival. I think it is not only paralyzed, but the paralysis risks also to question its institutional survival.
So it's several things on the line at the moment, not just I mean, Ukraine first and foremost, but also other institutions. So what's your assessment about the war that's going on at the moment? We have now this situation where one OSCE member attacks another one, and on the other side, OSCE members are now delivering a lot of weapons into Ukraine. I mean, are we witnessing a proxy war between Russia and the United States, or are we witnessing the outgrowth of a local insurgents that spiraled out of control? How do you see it?
I think there are two conflicts. I think there is a Russian-Ukrainian conflict indeed, but this is of course also to a large extent also a conflict between the West and Russia, and it's also more or less more by all sides being portrayed as such, and so in that sense. I think you couldn't, even if you were to try, you couldn't solve it solely on a Ukrainian-Russian logic. I think the wider picture would have to be brought in if you want to get out of this crisis.
So if you could propose something with the knowledge you have about the international organizations, if you could propose a plan to get out of the war, how would you do it?
Well, I think those reflections that led to the Istanbul communique, I think they would still seem promising to me. So I think they should be taken up again. It was unfortunate, that then these terrible pictures that we saw from Bucha, from Mariupol, kind of, led to a situation where potential Western guarantor states kind of said, we would not agree to be part of a multilateral agreement with Russia as a signatory. And this, of course, was kind of the trick of the core suggestion in the Istanbul communique, that you would have a kind of a status solution building on neutrality and international guarantees that, as Ukrainians insisted, would come close to Article 5 guarantees, that you find in NATO. And so now I would still argue this neutrality versus guarantee approach is an approach that is worth pursuing. But now, as I understand, Ukraine is bilaterally negotiating with potential guarantor states, and an agreement with Russia would then be in parallel with agreements with potential guarantors. And then, of course, the second issue that was not resolved in Istanbul is the issue on the territorial concessions. And here, I think, with a view to a future European security order, one would want a solution that implies as little territorial concessions as possible. And if there are territorial concessions, that they would be negotiated in line with international law. And I think this is, at least for the situation of Crimea, I think this is, there are at least in theory, I think political scientists could come up, with proposals to deal with Crimea in a way compatible with international law. this is much more difficult to think for the Donbass, and in particular also if indeed and this is my assumption, that Russian military objectives are pertaining to Lugansk and Donetsk within their administrative boundaries, which is a big chunk of Eastern Ukraine. And this, of course, would then basically send out the signal that, yes, also in the 21st century, you can change borders by military force. And that's not, the kind of message that we want to take with us when we reflect about the future European security order. So when it comes to cut a long story short, when it comes to the territories, I think they're very difficult questions that for which I, for the time being, don't see an easy solution.
That is true, because like as soon as you ask Russian colleagues, they automatically point to Kosovo and they point to the Golan Heights, and they ask you, so why would that only count for us and not on others? So it's a very unfortunate situation where we are in terms of helping international law instead of undermining it. Ambassador Greminger, it's about time, and I think we have to close the discussion, but thank you very much for your explanations. They were very valuable.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.